No one in town dared to step inside that old barn after sunset, until one broken farmer followed the sound of a horse crying in the dark. They said the barn at the edge of the valley was cursed, that if you listened after midnight, you'd hear a horse crying from inside. For years, everyone stayed away. But when a lonely farmer named Eli Ward heard that sound during a storm, something in him refused to turn back. What he found inside would change everything he believed about fear, forgiveness, and love. They said no one went near the old barn after sunset. It stood at the far edge of the valley where the wheat fields turned into dry, cracked earth, and the wind lost its tune. Its wooden boards leaned inward, splintered and gray, as if the structure itself was tired of existing. Children dared each other to touch its door, and grown men lowered their voices when they passed by. Some swore that on stormy nights you could hear something crying from inside. Not quite a human sound. Not quite animal either. Eli Ward never believed in ghost stories. He used to laugh when folks whispered about curses or restless souls. But that was before the fire, before his world went quiet. Now, the man who once forged iron with steady hands lived alone in a small cabin beyond the wheat fields. His wife, Clara, and their daughter, Ella May, had been gone for 5 years, taken by a blaze that started in the stables one wind-whipped night. Since then, Eli had stopped listening to people, to the wind, to life itself. That night, the storm rolled in fast, sweeping through the Kansas Valley with a voice like thunder tearing open the sky. Eli sat by the window, staring at the flicker of lightning cutting across the fields. The smell of wet earth crept into the house through a crack in the wood. He reached for his old oil lantern, more out of habit than need. Then, between the roar of thunder and the hiss of rain, he heard it. Faint, fragile, and broken. A sound like a sob. Eli froze. The rain hammered harder, but the sound came again, carried on the wind. It was not the cry of a person, nor the scream of wind through boards. It was the low, trembling whinny of a horse. He knew that sound. It came from deep in the chest, born from fear and pain. For a moment he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. But when lightning split the sky again, his eyes caught a shape in the distance. The old barn, half collapsed and trembling under the weight of the storm. The crying rose once more, longer this time. His heart clenched. Something about that sound felt too close, too familiar. He stood, his hand still shaking from the memory of another night filled with smoke and screams. He tried to turn away, telling himself it wasn't real, that it was just the wind and old wood groaning. But something in him, a quiet, aching instinct, refused to ignore it. He threw on his coat, took the lantern, and stepped out into the storm. The rain slapped against his face, cold and punishing. But he didn't stop. His boots sank into the mud, the light from his lantern swaying with every step. He knew every inch of that valley, yet tonight it felt foreign, haunted. When he reached the dirt road that curved toward the barn, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. As he drew closer, the barn loomed against the dark horizon like a half-buried skeleton. Its roof sagged, its walls wheezed with every gust. Eli stopped a few yards away. The sound came again, softer now, a plea. His horse, a calm old gelding named Jasper, snorted and tried to pull back. "Easy, boy," Eli murmured, resting a hand on the animal's neck. "We'll just take a look." He dismounted, boots squelching in the mud, and lifted the lantern higher. Light spilled across the broken boards of the barn door. A faint reflection flickered deep inside, as if a pair of eyes had caught the flame for a heartbeat, and then vanished. Eli's pulse quickened. He could feel his own breath in his chest. Steady. Reluctant. "Hello?" he called out, his voice almost lost in the wind. "Anyone there?" No answer. Only that soft, aching sound again, somewhere behind the rotting wood. Eli took a cautious step forward. The barn door creaked in protest, moaning on its rusted hinges. He could smell old hay, mildew, and something faintly metallic, iron, maybe, or blood. The air was thick and heavy, alive with tension. And then he stopped. The crying had ceased. The barn was silent now, the kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums and made the world smaller. He took one more step, and the lantern light trembled over a beam of wood blackened by fire. His throat tightened. For the first time in years, Eli's hands shook. Not from fear, but from recognition. That burn mark on the beam. He had seen it before, long ago, on another night like this one. A gust of wind howled through the gaps in the wall, blowing out the lantern flame. The barn vanished into darkness. Eli stood still, heart pounding in the wet silence, and from somewhere inside the shadows, barely a whisper now, came the faintest sound, the soft clink of metal against wood, like a bell too old to ring properly. He turned toward the sound, eyes straining to see. The storm raged on outside, but within those walls, something was waiting. Something that had been waiting for him for years. Morning crept into the valley like a slow apology. The storm had passed, but the land still wore its bruises. Muddy fields, broken branches, the heavy smell of rain-soaked earth. Eli Ward stood at the edge of his porch, the lantern from last night still hanging by the door, its glass cracked and blackened from the wind. He hadn't slept. His hands were still trembling, his mind replaying the sound that had drawn him toward the barn. For 5 years, Eli had lived inside his silence. The neighbors said he'd gone strange since the fire, but truth was simpler. He had just stopped listening. After losing Clara and son, little Ella May, sound became a punishment. Every voice, every laugh, every knock at the door carried weight he could no longer bear. So he built his days around quiet things, the rhythm of a hammer on iron, the sigh of wind through the wheat, the low hum of his own breathing. He'd once been known across the county for his craftsmanship, a blacksmith whose horseshoes lasted through any season. People trusted his work. But after the fire, after the screams and the smell of burning hay, Eli closed his forge for good. The flames had eaten more than wood and flesh that night. They had taken his purpose. He sold most of his tools, kept only a few. Maybe as a reminder, maybe as a punishment. This morning, though, something was different. That sound from the barn, the soft whimper of a horse. It wouldn't leave him. He could still hear it between heartbeats, faint and fragile, as though the storm had trapped it in his chest. He poured himself a cup of coffee, gone cold, and stared out at the wheat fields glinting under the pale sun. Somewhere beyond them, the barn waited. At the diner in town, Eli took a seat near the window, hat in hand. Conversations hushed when he walked in. They always did. He nodded at the waitress, a kind woman named Ruth, who'd known Clara. She brought him black coffee and said, "Haven't seen you in here for months, Eli." He gave a half smile, the kind that never reached his eyes. "You ever heard anything from that old barn after a storm?" he asked quietly. Ruth froze for a heartbeat, the pot of coffee hovering above his cup. "That place?" she whispered. "You don't want to go near it. Folks say it's cursed." From a corner table, someone muttered, "That's where Harlan Baxter died, ain't it?" Eli turned his head slightly. "Who?" An old man with tobacco-stained fingers leaned forward. "Farmer owned them horses back in the day. Big temper, bigger pride. They said one of his mares went mad, kicked him dead. After that, the town sealed up the place. No one's touched it since." "Or so they say," another man added, laughing nervously. "You know how stories grow." The sheriff, Clyde Murdoch, walked in just then, shaking off his coat. He spotted Eli and frowned. "Morning, Ward." He took the seat across from him without asking. "You heading back to that barn last night?" Eli met his eyes but didn't answer. Clyde sighed. "You should let that place be. Some things aren't meant to be dug up again." Eli stared at the sheriff's badge, catching a glint of light. "What's in there, Clyde?" "Old ghosts," Clyde said simply, "and maybe a few that still bite." Outside, the sky was already dimming again, clouds gathering heavy in the west. Eli paid for his coffee and left without another word. As he walked past the post office, he saw a child standing on the boardwalk, pointing toward the hills. The boy whispered to his mother, "Ma, do you hear that?" But she just tugged him along. Eli paused, straining his ears. Nothing. Just the low rumble of wind over the valley. By the time he reached home, the air smelled of rain again. Jasper, his old horse, lifted its head from the trough and gave a soft snort. Eli ran his hand down the animal's neck, feeling the coarse hair beneath his fingers. "You heard it too, didn't you, boy?" he murmured. The lantern from last night still hung on the porch. He lifted it, turning it in his hands. The soot-stained glass had left black marks on his fingers. For a moment, he caught his reflection in the window. Hollow eyes, unshaven jaw, the faint burn scar that ran along his wrist. He remembered the fire as if it were still happening. The glow, the crack of wood, the scream that had torn through the wind. And over it all, a sound he hadn't let himself remember until now. The panicked cry of a horse, the same tone, the same pitch as what he'd heard last night. He set the lantern down, breathing hard. The memory was a weight pressing on his chest. Clara's voice, calm even in fear. "Eli, get her out first." Ella May crying, "She's scared, Daddy. She won't move." Then the flames. He closed his eyes, gripping the edge of the porch. Maybe he'd gone mad, chasing echoes of what was gone. But what if he hadn't? What if something really was trapped in that barn, something left behind, something waiting for him to listen again? When the wind rose once more, brushing through the fields with that hollow hum, Eli made his choice. He took his coat, his gloves, and the lantern, cleaned and refilled. Jasper pawed the dirt, uneasy but ready. As the first drops of rain began to fall again, Eli swung into the saddle. His voice was a whisper to the wind. "If there's something still calling, I'll hear it this time." And with that, he rode toward the edge of town, toward the place everyone else had learned to avoid, but where he knew deep down, the truth of his silence was waiting to break. The second night fell heavier than the first. Clouds pressed low over the valley like a hand over a mouth, and the air carried that strange stillness that comes before the rain decides to fall. Eli Ward sat on the edge of his porch, oil lantern beside him, boots muddy from the long day. His hammer and anvil sat unused. Even the faint metallic smell of iron seemed to fade from the air. All he could hear was the slow ticking of his own heartbeat and the whisper of the wind sliding through the wheat. Somewhere beyond that silence, he knew the barn waited, watching him as much as he watched it. When the first lightning split the sky, Jasper, his old horse, stirred in the stable. Eli rose, setting his hat low on his brow, and looked toward the horizon. Rain started as a whisper and grew into a roar. The scent of wet soil flooded the air. He hadn't planned to go anywhere tonight, but something in the storm, the rhythm of it, the low grumble of thunder, felt like an unfinished sentence calling his name. He stepped down into the mud, lantern swinging in one hand. The valley was a blur of darkness and light, flashes of white revealing the long scars of old fences, the sagging roof lines of forgotten sheds. With each step, Eli's boots sank deeper, until every movement seemed to drag against the past. The sound came again, faint, muffled by the rain, but unmistakable. A horse's cry. He froze, rain streaming down his face. The sound wasn't wild, not angry. It was a broken, pleading noise, the kind that sits low in the chest, where fear turns to surrender. Jasper shifted restlessly behind him, pulling on the reins, ears pinned back. Eli steadied him. "It's all right, boy," he whispered, though his own voice trembled. "We just need to see." They moved slowly down the dirt road. The lightning flared again, outlining the barn against the night like a ghost risen from the earth. The door hung crooked, half off its hinges, one board banging with every gust of wind. Eli felt a memory tugging at him. Another night, another storm, the same smell of rain mixed with smoke. He shook his head as if to chase it away. When they reached the fence line, Jasper refused to go further. The horse's breath came fast, hot clouds in the cold air. Eli tied him to a post and raised the lantern higher. Rain hissed against the glass, dimming the flame, but not killing it. "Stay," he murmured. "I won't be long." He pushed the door with his shoulder. It groaned open, protesting years of neglect. Inside, shadows moved like living things. The beam of light caught dust and cobwebs drifting in the damp air. He could smell rot, wet hay, and something else. Something metallic that made the back of his throat tighten. He thought of the old stories the townsfolk told, the ones he'd brushed off earlier that day at the diner. But fear was not what gripped him now. It was curiosity and guilt. "Hello?" His voice echoed through the hollow space, small against the storm's rage. Then he saw it. A shape moved in the far corner, trembling, shrinking from the light. For a heartbeat, Eli thought it might be a trick of shadow, a pile of rotted beams, maybe. But then it shifted again, and the lantern caught the outline of ribs under pale skin. The horse stood there, chained to a post, soaked through and shaking. Its mane clung to its neck, its head low as if it could no longer carry its own weight. Eli's breath caught. The animal looked half-starved, half-spirit. One eye was clouded white, the other glimmered amber under the flicker of the lantern. The chain around its neck was so tight, it had rubbed the flesh raw. He stepped closer, boots creaking over the boards. "Easy," he whispered. "It's all right." The horse flinched, pressing itself against the wall, hooves scraping wood. The sound cut through him, sharp as a blade. He stopped, lowering the lantern so its light fell softer across the room. Every instinct told him to back away. Every instinct also told him that if he left now, the crying would never stop. He scanned the space around him. Broken tools, a rusted water bucket, the remains of a collapsed stall. On the ground, half buried in mud and hay, something glinted. Eli knelt, brushing away the dirt with his fingers. It was a small metal bell, no larger than his thumb, corroded green with age. The sound of the chain clinking nearby made him glance up again, and for the first time he noticed the horse's collar, an old leather strap with a torn buckle, and a faint engraving worn nearly smooth. The letters were barely there, but when he tilted the light just right, he could make them out. I-L-L, he froze. His chest tightened until it hurt to breathe. That name, it clawed at something buried deep inside him. Willow, he whispered. The horse's ears flicked at the sound. Eli stumbled back a step, gripping the lantern as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. He hadn't spoken that name in years. Willow had been Ella May's horse, the same one that refused to leave the stable the night of the fire, the one he thought had perished with them. The storm cracked open above him, thunder rolling through the valley like a scream. He looked at the scarred beam above the stall, blackened and splintered. The memory slammed into him. His wife's voice shouting, "She won't leave without the horse!" The smell of burning straw. The last sound. A horse crying. Eli staggered backward, heart pounding, the truth dawning cold and merciless. The stories weren't curses or ghost tales. The barn wasn't haunted by evil. It was haunted by grief. He moved closer again, hand trembling as he reached toward the chain. "It's you," he said softly, barely breathing the words. "God help me, it's you." The horse stood still now, one eye watching him, the other a white blur. Rainwater dripped from the roof through a hole above them, falling like tears onto the ground. "I thought you were gone," he whispered. His voice cracked. "I thought—" The lantern flickered, shadows crawling across the walls. For a long moment, nothing moved except the flame and the trembling animal. And then slowly, the horse took a small step toward him, the chain clinking softly, its breath visible in the cold air. Eli didn't know if it was forgiveness or fear that moved her. Maybe both. Maybe it didn't matter. He reached out, his fingers brushing the cold iron links. Another thunderclap shook the barn, and the lantern went out. Darkness swallowed them whole. For a heartbeat, Eli heard nothing. Then came the faint sound again, not of crying this time, but of slow, heavy breathing beside him. The warmth of another living thing filled the blackness. He could feel it, fragile, waiting. Outside, the storm raged on, washing the valley clean. Inside, a man and a horse stood in the dark, two remnants of the same fire, both too stubborn, or too lost, to let the other go. By morning, the storm had moved east, leaving the town washed clean and glistening beneath a thin veil of mist. The roads still shimmered with puddles, and the air carried that smell only Kansas rain could make. Wet earth, old wood, and something almost sweet, like the breath of wheat. Eli Ward walked into town with mud on his boots and exhaustion in his eyes. He hadn't slept a single hour. The image of that barn and the trembling horse inside it still pulsed behind his eyelids, as vivid as if the lightning were still flashing. The diner was half full when he pushed open the door. A bell above it jingled softly, one of those ordinary sounds that suddenly felt strange after what he'd seen. Ruth glanced up from behind the counter and frowned. "You look like you've been through the war, Eli." He managed a weak smile. "Feels like it." She poured him a cup of coffee. "You been back to that barn?" He nodded. "There's a horse in there, Ruth. Still alive. Been chained up for God knows how long." Her hand froze mid-pour. "That's not possible," she whispered. "That place has been empty for near 15 years. You must have heard something else. Wind, maybe." "I know the sound of a horse in pain," he said. His tone wasn't angry, just tired, a man stating fact. "It's there. I saw her." At the next booth, two farmers exchanged uneasy glances. One of them muttered, "He's talking about the cursed barn again." Eli ignored them, but their whispers followed him like gnats. It was always the same in small towns. Fear travels faster than truth. He sipped his coffee and looked out the window. The clouds were breaking, sunlight glinting off the wet roofs. For the first time in years, he felt the faintest sense of purpose pushing through the cracks of his guilt. Then the door swung open, and Sheriff Clyde Murdoch walked in. His uniform was damp, his expression grim. He spotted Eli immediately. "Morning, Ward." Eli nodded. "Clyde." The sheriff took the stool beside him and signaled for his own coffee. "Heard you been poking around out there again?" "There's something in that barn," Eli said quietly. "A horse, starved, scared half to death." Clyde stirred sugar into his cup, eyes fixed on the swirl. "You know what they say about that place. Some things are better left alone." Eli turned to him. "You don't believe that nonsense." "I believe what I saw," Clyde replied. "And what I saw was what was left after Harlan Baxter died. The man kept that animal chained up even when it turned mean. Killed him one night, or so the story goes. Folks boarded the barn, left it to rot. You going in there won't change that." Eli's jaw tightened. "Then you're saying I should let her die in there?" Clyde sighed. "I'm saying you already tried to save one once." His voice dropped. "And we both know how that ended." The words hit like a slap. For a moment, the air between them went still. Ruth looked up, ready to intervene, but Eli just pushed back from the counter. He placed a few coins beside the untouched plate of eggs. "If I'd listened to myself back then, maybe she'd still be alive," he said quietly. "Maybe they both would." He left before anyone could answer. Outside, the wind had shifted, carrying the scent of the fields and something faintly metallic, like rust or memory. He walked down Main Street, past the post office and the church. The world moved on as it always did, but Eli felt like a man walking through the past. A few townsfolk watched him go, whispering about the widower with the haunted eyes. By the time he reached home, the sun had dipped behind the hills again, casting long blue shadows over the valley. Jasper lifted his head from the trough and whickered softly. Eli brushed his mane absently, lost in thought. "I saw her, Jasper," he murmured. "She's alive, or something close to it." He took the lantern from the porch, wiped the soot from the glass, and set it beside his tools. The sound of the chain still rang in his mind, that dull, rhythmic clink, like a heartbeat caught between walls. He sat at his workbench and unrolled an old leather pouch. Inside lay his forge tools, tongs, hammer, small chisels, most untouched since the night of the fire. He lit a candle and ran his thumb over the burn marks on the hammer's handle. The steel was still cold, but the memory of heat bloomed in his chest. "You once built things that lasted," he whispered to himself. Maybe it's time you do again. He worked until the candle burned low, shaping a new piece of iron, not for sale, not for a horse's shoe, but something else. A small hook, sturdy and curved, the kind that could free a chain. Sparks hissed softly, glowing orange against the dark. It felt strange, the sound of metal ringing again in the silence. Almost human. Near midnight, a knock echoed at his door. He frowned, wiping his hands on a rag. When he opened it, Sheriff Clyde stood there, hat in hand. "You're not planning to go back out there tonight, are you?" the sheriff asked. Eli leaned against the doorframe. "Why? You gonna stop me?" "I ought to," Clyde said, "because I remember what that fire did to you. You think saving this one's gonna bring them back? But it won't. Sometimes redemption's just another word for punishment." Eli's gaze dropped to the sheriff's badge glinting in the moonlight. "Maybe," he said, "but maybe not trying is worse." For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the sigh of wind through the wheat outside. Finally, Clyde nodded once, slow and heavy. "You always were too damn stubborn," he muttered, stepping off the porch. "Just don't let it kill you this time." Eli watched him disappear down the path. Then he turned back toward the small forge, its coals dimming, the air still smelling faintly of smoke and iron. On the workbench, the hook cooled to black. He ran a finger along its edge and thought of the chain around Willow's neck. He didn't know if the horse would survive or if the town's fears would swallow them both. But for the first time since the fire, the silence around him didn't feel empty. It felt like a beginning. He looked out toward the valley, where the barn lay hidden beyond the curve of the hills. The wind carried a low sound again, distant but unmistakable, the faint echo of a whinny carried through the night. Eli closed his eyes. "I'm coming," he whispered. And somewhere far away, a bell that hadn't rung in years gave a single, lonely chime. The next night came without stars. The sky hung low and gray, the kind of sky that made even the strongest men hesitate before stepping outside. But Eli Ward didn't hesitate. He'd spent the whole day fighting the thought of going back, telling himself it was madness. Yet as dusk deepened and the world turned blue, he found himself saddling Jasper again, lantern swinging from the saddle horn like a small, trembling sun. The road to the barn was softer now, still soaked from the storm. Each hoofstep sank with a quiet, wet sound, the air filled with the smell of damp wheat and rusting fences. The valley seemed to hold its breath. He could feel it in the way the wind moved, slow, circular, like it was waiting for something. When the shape of the barn appeared at last, it rose from the dark like a wound in the land. The roof leaned farther than he remembered, and the boards along the wall had begun to peel away, leaving gaps where the night slipped through. The lantern light trembled over the ground, catching on puddles and old hoofprints. Jasper stopped short at the fence line, muscles tightening beneath Eli's legs. The horse's ears pinned back, a low, uneasy sound rising from his chest. Eli dismounted, patting the gelding's neck. "It's all right," he murmured. "Stay here. I have to see it through." He tied the reins to a post and stepped forward, boots squelching in the mud. The smell hit him first, damp wood, mold, and something sharp beneath it, something like iron. The same scent he'd carried on his clothes for years after the fire. His stomach turned, but he kept moving. The door was half open, creaking softly as the wind breathed through. Eli lifted the lantern higher and stepped inside. The flame flickered across the ruined interior. Broken boards, a few fallen beams, piles of rotted hay that glistened faintly with moisture. The far corner was darker than the rest. He moved toward it, slow and careful, the sound of his footsteps muffled by the dirt. "Willow?" His voice came out low, hesitant. "You still here, girl?" A sound answered him. Soft, almost a sigh. Then a movement, the scrape of a hoof against the floor. When the light reached her, his breath caught again. The horse was still there, standing exactly where he'd left. Her, but weaker now. Her head drooped low, one knee trembling under the strain of holding her own weight. The chain around her neck pulled taut every time she moved. "God," he whispered. He crossed the distance quickly, setting the lantern on a beam beside them. The light painted the scars on her coat, old burns that ran along her flank like rivers of shadow. She flinched when he reached out, but she didn't back away this time. Eli crouched beside her, studying the iron ring embedded in the beam. The metal was rusted, but thick. He tried pulling the chain, but it held firm. He pressed his palm to it. It was cold, even in the warmth of the lantern light. "Who did this to you?" he murmured. The question wasn't meant for an answer, but in the stillness, the truth came to him anyway. The townsfolk had sealed the barn after Baxter's death, left the animals inside to starve or die. They'd feared superstition more than they'd feared cruelty. And somehow, this one had survived. He stood and began examining the wall, looking for something to use. Half buried beneath a collapsed stall, he found an old shovel, its handle split, but its edge still sharp enough. He wedged it under the chain's bracket and pushed. The wood groaned, but didn't give. His muscles strained, the effort reopening the ache in his chest. Willow shifted behind him, her breath rasping shallow and uneven. "Easy, girl," he said between gasps. "I'm not giving up on you." The bracket snapped suddenly, metal shrieking against wood. The sound echoed through the barn like a scream, startling Willow. She stumbled back, jerking the chain. Eli nearly lost his footing but caught the lantern before it fell. The flame flared bright for a moment, and in that light he saw something carved into the post beside the beam, a faint engraving worn smooth by time. It was a name. E.M. He stared, frozen. His breath left him in a single sharp exhale. Those letters, the same initials that were once stitched onto his daughter's saddle blanket, the same ones engraved on the small bell he'd found buried in the hay. He traced the grooves with his fingertip, the wood rough beneath his hand. His throat closed around her name. "Ella May," he whispered, barely able to speak. The horse lifted her head slightly at the sound, ears twitching. Eli turned toward her. "You remember her, don't you? My little girl." His voice trembled. "You stayed with her that night. You didn't run." His vision blurred. He saw flashes of the fire again, not as memory now, but as revelation. Ella's small hands unbuckling the reins, her voice calling for Willow to move, and then the flames rushing in. The horse refusing to leave. The panic, the smoke. He'd blamed himself for running when the roof collapsed, for not saving them. But the truth hit him like a blow. Willow hadn't died. She had stayed. She had carried that night inside her the same way he had. Eli sank too, his knees beside her, tears cutting clean lines through the dirt on his face. "You didn't kill anyone," he said hoarsely. "You tried to save her." For a long moment, the barn was silent except for the wind whispering through the cracks. Then Willow stepped closer, the chain dragging across the floor with a low scrape. She lowered her head until her muzzle brushed his shoulder. The touch was light, hesitant, but real. Eli closed his eyes and let out a shuddering breath. "It's over now, girl. You're going home." He picked up the lantern and the shovel again. The flame was dying, shrinking to a faint orange glow. He struck the chain once, twice, each hit ringing sharp and desperate. Finally, on the third blow, the last link gave way. The chain fell, clattering onto the floorboards. Willow staggered forward, free, but uncertain. Eli dropped the shovel and stood, watching her. The mare lifted her head, ears flicking toward the doorway where the wind whistled faintly. Her chest rose and fell in slow, uneven breaths. She didn't bolt. She didn't even move far. Instead, she turned toward him again, one good eye glimmering like wet amber. He reached out, fingers brushing her mane. "You're free," he whispered. Outside, the wind picked up, whirling through the valley and rattling the broken boards. It carried the faint sound of the old bell, hanging from the eaves. One single note, soft and clear. Eli looked toward the door, then back at Willow. "Let's go," he said. She took one hesitant step, then another, the sound of her hooves slow but sure. Together they crossed the threshold, out of the ruin and into the night air. The clouds had parted just enough for a sliver of moonlight to fall across the valley. It lit the wheat like a river of silver. For the first time in years, Eli breathed deep. The air was cold, wet, and real. Beside him, Willow lifted her head and gave a long, low exhale that sounded almost like relief. The barn creaked behind them, its door swaying gently in the wind. The ruin they left behind no longer felt cursed. It felt emptied of fear, of grief, of the ghosts that had lived too long inside it. As they stood under the moon, Eli turned to look one last time. "You did good, girl," he said softly. "You did what I couldn't." Willow blinked slowly, her breath warm against his hand. And for that brief, impossible moment, the night didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt whole. Morning came pale and slow, light spreading across the valley like the memory of a forgotten song. The rain had stopped, and a low mist clung to the grass, making everything shimmer faintly silver. Eli Ward stood outside the barn, its old boards glistening with dew, his hands still sore from the night before. The broken chain lay on the ground where it had fallen, half buried in mud. Willow grazed nearby, cautious but calm, her movements slow, as if relearning the meaning of freedom. Eli leaned against the fence. Exhaustion, heavy in his bones. The air smelled cleaner than he remembered. Mud, hay, and that faint sweetness of wild wheat in bloom. He took a deep breath, feeling something loosen inside him. It had been so long since the world had smelled like life. He turned toward the barn again. In the soft morning light, it looked different, less like a tomb, more like a wound that had finally stopped bleeding. Inside, the shadows no longer felt thick with fear. He picked up his lantern, still blackened from the storm, and stepped into the doorway. Dust motes danced in the sunlight pouring through the cracks. The silence here was peaceful now, not suffocating. Something caught his eye near the spot where Willow had stood. A small glint beneath the hay. Faint, but unmistakable. He crouched, brushing the dirt away with his hands until the object came free. It was a bell. Tiny, rusted, the leather strap that once held it long since rotted away. He turned it over in his palm. Despite its age, the engraved initials were still visible. E.M. For a long moment, he couldn't move. The world seemed to narrow to the weight of that small bell in his hand. He felt his knees weaken and sank onto the floorboards. "Ella May," he whispered. The name left his lips like a prayer. The bell had belonged to his daughter. He remembered the day he'd bought it at the county fair. She'd been 7, her blonde hair tied in 2 uneven braids, her face flushed from excitement. She'd begged for that bell, said she wanted Willow to have it so she could always find her in the fields. So even when she's far, I'll hear her. Eli swallowed hard, his throat burning. The memory was too clear, too sharp. He could almost hear her laughter mingling with the faint chime that used to echo through their pasture. Now that same bell sat silent in his hand, its voice long gone. He stood, brushing the dust from his coat. The light slanted through the barn's broken roof, catching the bell's edge. It gleamed faintly, like an ember refusing to die. Eli tied it to a thin strip of rope he found hanging from a nail, and looped it gently around Willow's neck. When it touched her chest, the mare flinched, then stood still, ears twitching. The bell gave a soft, almost hesitant sound. "That's her," Eli said quietly. "She used to ring it every morning." The horse turned her head toward him. For the first time since he'd found her, she looked at peace. Not healed, not yet, but still something had shifted. She reached her muzzle toward his sleeve, breathing against it. The warmth of her breath trembled through him like forgiveness. He stayed beside her for a while, hand resting against her mane, the faint sound of the bell blending with the rustle of the wind. He thought of his wife, Clara, of how she'd hum in the evenings as she brushed Willow's coat, whispering things only horses and mothers understood. He thought of how he'd promised to protect them both, and how he'd failed. "I can't change what happened," he murmured, almost to himself. "But maybe I can do one thing right." When he stepped back outside, the sun had broken through the last of the clouds. The valley stretched wide and golden, and the old barn cast a long shadow behind him. He turned to look at it one last time. From this distance, it didn't look haunted at all. Just tired, like something that had carried too much for too long. The bell chimed again, soft and clear. It wasn't loud, but it carried far. He watched Willow lift her head to the sound, her one good eye bright against the light. For a heartbeat, she looked young again. Eli walked back toward the fence and sat on the rail. He could hear the faint buzz of bees from a nearby thicket, the trickle of water from the creek that had swollen with rain. The sounds of life, the kind he'd tried to shut out for years, felt different now. He realized he wasn't afraid of them anymore. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small photo he'd carried for years, the edges worn, the image nearly faded. It showed Ella May in her Sunday dress, standing beside Willow, one hand holding the bell at the horse's neck. The memory rose again, Ella's voice saying, "If you listen long enough, Daddy," she talks back. He smiled, just barely. "I'm listening now, kiddo," he said softly. Behind him, Willow let out a long, low breath, as if she understood. The bell rang again, just once, its tone softer now, gentler. As the day stretched on, Eli repaired the fence around the barn, fixing the loose posts and tightening the rails. He didn't know why. No one had asked him to. Maybe it was for the same reason he'd come back at all. Some things needed mending, even if no one believed they could be fixed. When he finished, he leaned on the top rail, sweat streaking his temples. Willow stood near the barn door, tail swishing lazily, the bell at her throat glinting whenever she moved. The sun caught the metal and threw sparks of gold across the grass. Eli felt something stir in his chest, something that had been buried for 5 long years, a quiet warmth he couldn't name. Not joy exactly, but something close. As the afternoon light softened, he turned toward the house. Halfway up the path, he looked back. Willow stood watching him, still and steady, her bell chiming faintly with each breath. "Good girl," he called softly. "You stay close tonight." The wind carried the smell of rain again, though the sky remained clear. It whispered through the valley like a memory finally learning to fade. That night, Eli couldn't sleep. He sat by the window with a cup of coffee cooling in his hand, listening to the distant sound of the bell. It came and went with the wind. Soft, uncertain, alive. He thought about everything Clyde had said, about leaving the past buried. But the sound of that bell said otherwise. It said that maybe the past wasn't meant to be buried. It was meant to be understood. He set the coffee aside, resting his hand against the cool glass of the window. Somewhere out there in the moonlit fields, Willow moved through the grass, her shadow long and graceful, her bell ringing faintly with each step. Eli whispered into the night, "I hear you, Ella. I hear her." The words hung in the air for a long time, carried on the same wind that had once brought him sorrow. Now it brought him something else, something lighter. The sound of the bell echoed one last time, clear and soft, before the valley fell quiet again. By dusk, the sky had turned the color of old copper. The sun dipped low behind the wheat fields, and the wind carried a faint chill that whispered of another storm brewing far away. Eli Ward stood outside his cabin, staring at the faint glow of the barn in the distance. He could see movement there, slow, deliberate. Willow was wandering near the fence, her bell chiming softly whenever she turned her head. That delicate sound had followed him all day, echoing inside his chest like a second heartbeat. He hadn't spoken to anyone since morning. Sheriff Clyde had passed by once, slow on his horse, giving Eli a look that said everything without a word. People in town had already started talking again. The widower who'd lost his mind, the farmer who chased ghosts. Eli didn't care. Let them talk. They hadn't heard the cries in that barn, hadn't seen the eyes that carried the same sorrow he'd seen in his own mirror for years. He lit the lantern and set it on the porch rail. The flame cast a gentle circle of gold around him. He could hear the faint hum of crickets, the low roll of thunder far beyond the valley. The world felt on the edge of something, like breath waiting to be released. He poured himself a small drink, whiskey he hadn't touched in years. The burn of it reminded him he was still alive. "For you, Clara," he murmured into the night, and lifted the glass slightly before setting it down. When the wind shifted, it brought with it the faintest sound of the bell again, mingled with a soft, low whinny. Eli's gaze drifted to the barn. He thought of the chain he'd cut, the initials on the post, the years Willow had survived in silence. Guilt pressed down on him like the weight of that old roof. He couldn't shake the thought that maybe the horse hadn't just been waiting to be freed. It had been waiting for him specifically. He grabbed his coat, the lantern, and started walking. The path between his house and the barn was damp from dew, the air heavy with the smell of earth and hay. Each step brought back memories he had buried deep. The laughter of a child running barefoot through the field, the sound of hammer on iron, the voice of his wife singing near the open window. All of it seemed to rise from the ground around him, ghostly and kind. When he reached the barn, Willow was standing in the doorway, as if she had been expecting him. Her one good eye caught the light and shimmered gold. She didn't flinch this time when he approached. The bell around her neck gave a soft, steady rhythm, small notes that somehow filled the emptiness between them. Eli set the lantern down on a beam. The shadows stretched long and soft around them. "You remember that night, don't you?" he said quietly. "You were there when everything ended." Willow shifted her weight, ears flicking back as if listening. Eli leaned against the wall, hands buried in his coat pockets. "I never told anyone what really happened," he said. "They thought I ran from the fire, said I left them. But that's not true." His voice cracked. "I tried to go back. God knows I tried." He took a shaky breath. "I saw the flames in the rafters. The smoke was everywhere. I could hear Ella crying, calling your name. You wouldn't move. She wouldn't leave you. When the roof fell..." His words caught in his throat. He swallowed hard. "I thought you were both gone. I should have gone back, but I froze. I heard that last sound, that scream, and I just ran." The confession spilled from him in pieces, his voice trembling like the lantern's flame. For years, those words had stayed locked behind his ribs, sharper than any blade. Now they hung in the air, heavy and real. Willow didn't move, but her breathing slowed, steady and deep. The sound filled the space between his sentences like understanding. Eli's hands shook. "I've lived with that night every damn day since. Woke up hearing her voice, smelling the smoke. I blamed you for so long. Told myself it was your fault, because it was easier than facing my own." He stepped closer, the floor creaking beneath his boots. The horse turned her head toward him, the amber eye reflecting his lantern's glow. In that gaze, he saw no anger, only the same quiet sorrow he'd carried for years. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "You tried to save her. I should have saved you both." He reached out slowly, hesitating just before his hand touched her muzzle. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The rain began to fall again outside, soft at first, then steadier, tapping gently against the roof. The sound mingled with the rhythm of the bell, creating something fragile and holy. Willow leaned forward, closing the space between them. Her nose brushed his shoulder, and he felt the warmth of her breath against his neck. The touch undid him. He pressed his forehead against hers, tears hot against the cool air. "It's all right," he murmured, voice breaking. "You're safe now. I'm here." The lantern flickered, throwing their shadows across the walls, one tall, one slight, two forms meeting in the middle. The sound of the rain filled the silence between sobs. After a long while, Eli pulled back slightly, wiping his face. The horse lifted her head again, calm now, her eye soft. He smiled faintly, though his chest still ached. "You know, she used to say you were smarter than most folks in this town. Guess she was right." The mare exhaled through her nose, almost like an answer. Eli chuckled under his breath, a sound so rare it startled even him. Outside, the storm gathered strength, the wind pressing against the old boards. But inside the barn, there was peace. A fragile, trembling peace, born from years of silence finally broken. Eli crouched to pick up the bell that hung against Willow's chest. It was warm now from her skin. He closed his fingers around it. "She'd be proud of you," he said softly. "And maybe, if I'm lucky, she'd forgive me too." The mare blinked slowly, lowering her head again until their foreheads met once more. For the first time, Eli didn't feel haunted by the touch. It wasn't a ghost reaching back. It was life. The storm howled outside, but neither of them flinched. The barn held steady against the wind, as if guarding the moment. Hours passed before the rain began to fade. The lantern had burned low, the light now just a faint pulse in the dark. Eli stayed there beside her, the two of them breathing in sync. The bell chimed faintly every few minutes, a lullaby for the wounded and the forgiven. When the first light of dawn crept through the cracks, it found them both standing still. Two survivors bound not by blood, but by the same ache. Eli brushed his hand along Willow's neck. "Thank you," he said simply. And for the first time, when he stepped outside into the pale morning, the air didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt new. The rain had washed the valley clean, and even the ruins of the past seemed to breathe easier. Behind him, the bell rang once more, a single clear note that lingered long after he'd closed the barn door. The air smelled of iron and rain. Dawn spread across the horizon in faint strokes of amber, painting the barn in half-light. Eli Ward stood by the open door, hands rough and blackened with dried mud. His eyes were swollen from a night without sleep, but something inside him had quieted, like a river finally slowing after years of flood. Willow stood in the center of the barn, the light brushing along her scarred side. Her breathing was calm, deep, unhurried. The bell at her neck swayed gently with each exhale, its sound soft, but steady, like a pulse. For the first time, she didn't shrink when Eli approached. The distance between man and horse had dissolved overnight, replaced by a silence that felt whole, not hollow. Eli reached for the remaining shackles still clinging to her legs. The old chains were welded into the beams, rust thick as scabs. He tugged gently, testing the metal's give, then stepped back to his workbench. He had brought his tools from home, the same tools that had gathered dust since the fire. The hammer, the tongs, the short-bladed forge knife. They were old companions, and they still knew his hands. He lit the small coal stove in the corner, the smell of burning iron rising like incense. The sound of the bell mingled with the soft hiss of fire. Outside, the valley was waking. Crows calling, wind moving through the wheat. It felt as if the world itself was holding its breath for what was about to come. Eli knelt beside Willow, the heat of the coals warming his back. "We're going to finish this," he said, voice low. "No more chains. No more ghosts." The mare shifted slightly, watching him with that single clear eye. When he raised the hammer, she didn't flinch. She only watched. The first strike came sharp, ringing through the barn. Sparks leapt from the metal, small bursts of light that danced before vanishing into the straw. The sound wasn't violent. It was cleansing, rhythmic, almost musical. He worked slowly, methodically. Each hit loosened years of rust. Each swing carried fragments of the man he used to be. The husband, the father, the craftsman. Sweat beaded on his brow and ran down his temples. His breath came hard, but he didn't stop. Between strikes, he would pause to steady Willow, murmuring, "Almost there, girl. Almost." When the last chain cracked open, the noise wasn't loud. It was a soft, tired sound, like something old letting go. The broken metal dropped to the floor with a dull thud. Willow lifted her leg, testing its freedom, then stamped once, a puff of dust rising beneath her hoof. Eli set down the hammer and sat back on his heels, staring at the pile of rusted iron. His hands shook, not from exhaustion, but from release. "You're free," he whispered again, though the words came out more like a prayer. The mare stepped forward, the bell at her neck chiming as she moved. She circled him once, slow and deliberate, then stopped. Her muzzle brushed the top of his head, light as a breath. He closed his eyes, a tear sliding down his cheek and landing in the dirt. He rose to his feet and looked toward the doorway. The sun was climbing now, spilling gold across the valley. It painted the barn walls with warmth, chasing away the last of the night's chill. Eli walked toward the open air, Willow following close behind. The light hit her coat, and for a moment, she looked like something divine. White turned to gold. Scars turned to silver. Outside, the world smelled alive again. The grass glistened with dew, and the wheat bent in the wind like it was bowing to her. She stepped into the sunlight, lifting her head, her chest expanding with a deep, steady breath. Then she did something Eli hadn't expected. She ran. It wasn't frantic or wild. It was graceful, full of power that had been locked away for years. Her bell sang in rhythm with her hooves as she circled the clearing, kicking up sprays of mud and light. Eli watched, motionless, awe breaking across his face like sunrise. The sound of her freedom filled the valley, echoing between the hills. When she finally slowed and came back to him, he felt laughter bubbling in his chest, something he hadn't felt since before the fire. It came out soft, almost embarrassed, but it was real. "Look at you," he said. "Didn't think you had that left in you." The horse tossed her head lightly, the bell answering with a cheerful ring. Eli reached up, stroking her neck, and she leaned into his touch. He could feel her heartbeat beneath his palm, strong and steady. "Guess we both got more left than we thought," he murmured. He glanced down at the broken chains glinting near the barn door. They lay tangled in the mud like shed skin. He picked up one link, rubbing it between his fingers. It left a stain of rust on his thumb, a mark of what had been, but also of what had ended. He dropped it again, watching the sun catch the edges before the wind began to cover them with dust. Behind him, the coals in the forge flickered out, leaving a faint ribbon of smoke curling into the air. Eli turned back toward the barn one last time. The light pouring through the open door made the interior glow like the inside of a church. The scars on the beams looked softer now, less like wounds and more like history. He walked over and hung his hammer on a nail beside the doorway. It caught the sunlight and gleamed faintly. "We're done here," he said softly. "No more chains. Not for either of us." Willow gave a quiet snort, her ears twitching toward the fields beyond. Eli followed her gaze. The horizon stretched endlessly, painted gold and blue. Somewhere out there lay freedom, real, wild, uncontained. He didn't know if she would go or stay. Maybe it wasn't his decision to make. He stepped closer, resting his forehead against hers one last time. "You'll know what to do," he whispered. "You always did." The mare blinked slowly, her breath warm against his skin. Then she turned and began walking toward the open field, hooves pressing soft prints into the wet earth. The bell chimed with each step, fading as she went farther. Eli watched her until she disappeared over the rise, a pale shape swallowed by the light. For a long time, he stood there, the wind tugging gently at his coat. He felt the emptiness settle in his chest again. But this time, it didn't hurt. It was the kind of emptiness that comes after release, like a room cleared for something new. He looked down at his hands, black with soot and rust, then at the forge, where the last wisp of smoke curled upward like a promise. The chains were broken. The fire was out. And for the first time since the night of the fire, Eli Ward felt whole. He turned toward the valley, letting the wind dry the tears on his face. The wheat swayed gently, whispering like a voice he could almost recognize. "Thank you," he said aloud, to Willow, to his daughter, to the world. "Thank you." And somewhere far beyond the hills, faint and distant, came the sound of a single bell ringing against the wind. The first light of dawn spilled over the Kansas Valley, washing everything in gold and rose. It was one of those mornings that carried silence, like a blessing. No wind, no sound of machines, just the slow awakening of the earth. The barn that once stood heavy with darkness now gleamed faintly under the sun, its boards drying in the light, the scent of rain and wood rising like incense from its walls. Eli Ward stepped out of his cabin, a cup of black coffee steaming in his hand. The night had been long, but not restless. For the first time in years, his sleep had been clean, undisturbed by fire or screams. He didn't wake sweating, didn't wake reaching for ghosts. The ache in his chest remained, but it was quieter now, like a wound finally starting to knit closed. Out beyond the fence, he saw her. Willow stood near the creek, her coat shining pale in the sunrise, the bell at her neck catching glints of light with every small movement. She looked different now, stronger, no longer the trembling creature he'd found bound in chains. She moved with the grace of something that had remembered what freedom felt like. Eli set down the coffee and walked toward her, boots crunching softly against the wet grass. Each step felt easier, lighter, though the ground was still damp from the storm. Willow lifted her head when she saw him, ears twitching. The wind carried the faint jingle of the bell, and it filled the space between them like a wordless greeting. "Morning, girl," he said softly. "You look better today." She snorted lightly, the breath clouding in the cool air. When he reached her side, she didn't shy away. He ran his hand down her neck, feeling the warmth of her skin, the rhythm of life pulsing under it. "You ready for one last ride?" he asked, and for a heartbeat, it felt as if she nodded. He went back to the fence and pulled the old saddle from where it hung. The leather was cracked, the color faded, but it still held shape. He hadn't touched it since Ella May's last ride, since the day the world burned. His hands hesitated as he lifted it, the weight heavy with memory. The scent of it, the mix of leather, smoke, and time, hit him like a tide. But he carried it anyway, setting it gently across Willow's back. She stood still, calm, her head turning slightly as if to watch him. The straps creaked as he fastened them, the small clicks of the buckle almost musical in the quiet morning. When he was done, he stepped back and looked at her, She looked like she belonged there, not as a relic, but as a survivor. Eli mounted slowly, careful not to startle her. His joints protested. It had been years since he'd ridden. When he settled into the saddle, Willow shifted slightly, finding balance. The feeling that washed through him was strange and old, a mixture of fear and joy, of holding something precious and wild between his hands. They started at a walk, the rhythm slow and steady. The field opened before them, endless and shimmering with dew. Each hoofbeat left a dark print in the wet earth, a trail that glowed for a second before fading into the morning. The air was cool against his face, and he let himself breathe it in, deep and steady. The sound of the bell was constant now, a soft chiming that matched his heartbeat. He found comfort in it. He remembered Ella May's laughter, the way she used to cling to his arm, her tiny boots slipping in the stirrups, her voice calling, "Faster, Daddy, faster!" He had always pretended to scold her for being reckless, but he'd loved the sound of her joy. Now, hearing the bell, he swore he could almost hear her again. They crossed the low ridge where the valley dipped toward town. From there, Eli could see the rooftops catching the sun, the faint smoke rising from chimneys, the glimmer of the church steeple in the distance. People would be stirring soon, but for now, it was just him and Willow and the horizon. He nudged her forward, and she broke into a trot. The rhythm of her gait was smooth, steady, alive. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed this, the feeling of movement, of trust between man and animal. Each stride erased another layer of the weight he'd carried for years. When they reached the edge of the field, he saw a few figures near the main road, townsfolk out early for the market. They stopped what they were doing when they saw him. The whispers began almost immediately. A man in a weathered coat, riding the horse everyone thought had died long ago. Eli slowed Willow, letting her walk past them calmly. The faces he saw were a mix of awe and disbelief. Some crossed themselves, others simply stared. He heard one of them whisper, "That's her, the cursed mare." He didn't look their way. Instead, he leaned down slightly, whispering to Willow, "Easy now. They just don't know better." As they passed through town, even Sheriff Clyde came out onto the porch of his office. He tipped his hat, eyes soft with something like pride. Eli nodded back, but didn't stop. The sheriff didn't either. Some things didn't need words. They reached the far side of town, where the road opened into rolling hills. The wind here was stronger, carrying the scent of wildflowers and wet grass. Willow lifted her head, ears forward, nostrils flaring. Eli loosened the reins. "Go on," he said. "Show them." She broke into a gallop. The world blurred, the wind, the light, the sound of hooves against the soft earth. The bell sang wildly, each note sharp and pure, cutting through the morning like laughter. Eli held on, not out of fear, but because the feeling of motion was overwhelming, cleansing. It wasn't just a ride, it was resurrection. When she slowed again, they stood at the crest of a hill. The sun had climbed high enough to warm his back. Below them, the fields shimmered, the town small and quiet. Willow's sides heaved as she caught her breath, her mane whipping gently in the wind. Eli slid from the saddle, landing lightly despite his age. He looked out across the valley, the same valley where he had lost everything and somehow found it. Again. "We made it," he said softly. The horse turned her head toward him, the bell giving one last soft ring. He reached up, brushing her mane away from her face. "You were never cursed, girl," he said. "You were waiting." For a while, neither of them moved. The wind rustled through the wheat, carrying the faint scent of summer on its breath. The moment felt suspended, like the world itself had paused to watch. Then Willow did something that broke his heart and healed it at once. She stepped closer, pressing her head against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her neck, burying his face in her mane. The smell of her, earth and hay and rain, filled him until there was no room left for grief. After a long silence, Eli whispered, "Thank you." When they turned back toward home, the valley seemed brighter. The barn stood waiting, but it no longer looked like a grave. It looked like what it always should have been, a place where life had once begun and, somehow, had begun again. They walked side by side down the hill, the sound of the bell fading into the morning breeze. And as the first true warmth of the sun touched his back, Eli Ward realized something he'd never dared to believe. Redemption didn't come from erasing the past. It came from walking beside it, one quiet step at a time. The sun rose quiet and unhurried that morning, spilling over the Kansas plains in soft gold. The fields glowed with dew, and the air carried that sweet, clean scent that only comes after a storm has had its final say. Eli Ward stood by the porch, coffee cooling in his hand, and watched as Willow grazed at the far end of the property. The light caught her coat and made it shimmer like frost. The bell at her neck swayed faintly with each movement, the sound barely audible from where he stood. He had not ridden her since that morning through town. That ride had been enough. A full circle, a closing prayer. The townsfolk had stopped whispering now. Some came by the next day, quiet and respectful, to ask if they had really seen what they thought they'd seen. The old barn, once a place people avoided like a grave, had become something else. A few of the children even dared to play nearby, leaving little footprints in the mud. The sound of fear was gone from that place. Eli didn't talk about what happened. He didn't need to. There were no sermons, no explanations, just a man and a horse who had survived what others didn't. That was enough. Each morning, Willow wandered closer to the edge of the valley, where the wheat gave way to open fields and wild grass. Eli would watch her, a little anxious at first, until he realized she always came back. She had found her rhythm again, the freedom that had been taken from her. Watching her move through the light made something inside him soften, an old, heavy thing that had finally begun to let go. That afternoon, he walked down to the barn. The air was warm, and flies buzzed lazily around the wooden beams. The scent of dried hay filled the space, mixed with the faint metallic tang of the tools he'd left hanging on the wall. He touched the old hammer, the one that had freed her chains. The metal was cool now, the handle smooth where his hand had worn it. He thought of his daughter again, of her small hands gripping the reins, her laughter echoing down these same fields. The memory didn't hurt like it used to. It glowed instead, soft and golden, like sunlight through dust. "Guess we did it, kiddo," he said quietly. His voice barely carried, but in the stillness, it sounded enough. When he stepped outside again, the wind was rising, carrying a faint tune through the wheat, like a sigh or a hymn. Willow was standing near the fence, head lifted, ears pricked toward something distant. Eli followed her gaze and saw the horizon shimmering under the heat, an endless stretch of land that seemed to breathe. He walked over, the grass brushing his boots. "You thinking of going?" he asked softly. She turned her head toward him, and for a moment he swore he saw understanding in her gaze. She'd been born to run, not to stay caged. Maybe the time had come for her to return to where the wild things belonged. He reached for the rope, looped over the fence, and unhooked it, letting it fall to the ground. The gesture felt simple, almost ceremonial. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "You never did." The mare shifted her weight, hesitating. He stepped closer, resting a hand against her neck. "If you stay, I'll be grateful. But if you go, I'll still hear you." His voice wavered slightly. "I'll always hear you." The bell at her neck swayed as the wind grew stronger. She took one slow step forward, then another. Eli backed away, giving her space. When she finally turned toward the open valley, her mane caught the sunlight and flared like white fire. She paused once at the top of the rise, the place where the land dropped away into miles of waving wheat. The wind rushed around them, scattering dust and seeds. Eli stood still, his heart aching in that quiet, painful way that only love can ache. Then Willow ran. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't farewell. It was grace, pure and whole. Her hooves struck the ground in steady rhythm, the bell at her neck ringing bright and clear. Each note carried farther than the last, spilling across the hills until it became part of the wind itself. Eli watched her go, the shape of her shrinking against the golden sea. He didn't chase her. He didn't call out. He just stood there, hand shading his eyes, and let the wind do what it always did, carry what mattered onward. When the sound of the bell faded, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of memory, of forgiveness, of a kind of peace he hadn't believed existed anymore. The barn behind him creaked softly, the sound no longer mournful, but alive. He turned back toward the house. The world looked sharper now, colors deeper, the sky bluer, the fields richer, the air clearer. He could almost feel Clara's presence beside him, hear Ella's laugh echoing faintly. They weren't gone. They were everywhere. In the air, in the light, in the sound that had finally gone still. That evening, he sat on the porch as the sun slipped below the horizon. The world turned copper and violet, the kind of beauty that hurt if you looked too long. He didn't light the lantern. He didn't need to. The glow from the sky was enough. The night insects began their soft chorus, and the wind hummed through the wheat. He leaned back in the chair, closed his eyes, and listened. For a moment, he thought he heard it again, the faint chime of a bell far away, carried by the wind. Maybe it was just his imagination. Maybe it was something more. He smiled, the kind of smile that belongs only to those who've made peace with their ghosts. "Good night, girl," he whispered. "Run far. Run free." The stars came out, one by one. The barn stood still, its shadow long and quiet against the earth. Somewhere beyond the hills, a bell gave one final, fading ring. Then the valley was silent. But in that silence lived everything that mattered: love, loss, and the echo of mercy. And for the first time in a very long time, Eli Ward closed his eyes and slept deeply, peacefully, under a sky that finally seemed wide enough to hold them all. If this story touched your heart, Tell me what part stayed with you the most in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you'd like to join me for more true, heartfelt stories about people and the animals that change their lives, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.